Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing our lecture series on industrialization and more particular the progressive movement. So in our last lecture we discussed kind of what the progressive movement is and who are its supporters. Today we're going to actually be talking about some progressives and more specifically some progressive muckrakers or the journalists that are reporting on the perceived evils of the day. The first guy we're going to talk about is Lincoln Steffens. Lincoln Steffens is going to write a book called The Shame of Cities. And The Shame of Cities is really a book that's going to be calling for the reform of city governments. And it's going to expose political machines and how political machines have become abusive. Right. And so, through bribery and, outright theft, the machines that control this city are stealing from the people. And so he's going to talk about how, big business is in collusion with these political machines. And so I'm going to read you here an excerpt from the shame of cities. It says, now the typical American citizen is the businessman. The typical businessman is a bad citizen. He's busy. If he's a big businessman and very busy, he does not neglect. He is busy with politics. Oh, very busy and very businesslike. I found him buying bouliers, or those are political bribers, in St. Louis, defending grafters in Minneapolis, originating corruption in Pittsburgh, sharing with bosses in Philadelphia, deploring reform in Chicago, and he is beating good government with corrupt funds in New York. He is a self-righteous fraud, this big businessman. He is the chief source of corruption, and it were a boon if he would neglect politics. And so he's essentially saying it's these political machines that are being bought by big businesses that are keeping America from getting the reform it needs, whether that reform is safer working conditions or better pay, the legal formation of unions, or if it's to stop government corruption. These political machines are overcharging for the building of bridges and schools, and they're pocketing that money to, pay off their political bribes. And so Lincoln Steffens is going to write about this, and it's going to be, one of the things that's going to help bring down political machines all across America. Specifically, I mean, one of the worst is going to be Tammany Hall. Lincoln Steffens is going to take on Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed's Tammany Hall. We've talked about Boss Tweed in previous lectures. And so, it's Lincoln Steffens reporting on these issues that's really going to kind of turn the people against these political machines and is slowly going to start to fade them out. Now, political machines won't, I think, ever fully go away, right? There's always people peddling influence within the government for favors and whatnot. And so, these kind of political machines, at least a different version of them exists today, but Lincoln Steffens is going to really, be instrumental in making them much, much less dangerous. Next guy we're going to talk about is a guy by the name of Jacob Riis. This is Jacob Riis. He's as a young man, he immigrates to the United States and spends some time living in cities and runs out of money and finds out exactly how awful living in cities can be. And so what he does is he's going to write a book, and it's I say write, he does write, but it's really the thing that's moving about his book are the photographs. But he's going to write a book called How the Other Half Lives. Again, a lot of these things, kind of get their founding in McClure magazine, which is a progressive magazine of the time. And How the Other Half Lives, what it's about is exposing conditions in cities, primarily New York City. The conditions in these cities are awful, right? There's no really kind of regulation on, in the tenement housing. And so there are 10, 15, 20 people living in apartments that are designed for, 3 or 4 today. People are crammed in there. It's dirty. The infant death rate in New York City at the time is 1 in 10. That's how just destitute the people in New York are. And so, what he does is he essentially travels around, and he's going to travel around New York City. And what's interestingly enough, he's going to have a partner when he's traveling around New York City and taking pictures like this. And that partner is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt ends up becoming the police commissioner of New York. Lincoln Steffens helps him get that job. And as he's police commissioner of New York, Teddy Roosevelt's walking around with Jacob Riis, kind of just exploring the city with them, and he's going to be exposed to this kind of serious poverty. Now, remember from previous lectures, Teddy Roosevelt comes from one of the wealthiest families in America. He's not used to seeing this kind of poverty, and it's really going to affect him, and it's going to make him become a champion of the American worker. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is no enemy to big business either. He's one of those few Americans that recognizes that you can be both in favor of business and in favor of the worker. And one of the things that's going to lead him to that conclusion is traveling the streets with Jacob Riis. The other thing that Jacob Riis does is when he takes pictures, these are New York City poor, homeless young boys. A lot of times these are voluntarily homeless young men. So if you're living at home with mom and dad are struggling, you're just one more mouth to feed. When you get to be this age, 10, 11, 12, you start to feel like you're a burden. And so a lot of them will kind of run away and fend for themselves, not because they're rejecting their parents, but because their parents are struggling to feed. Maybe you got a little brother or sister that needs food, and so you stand a better chance to survive out on the streets on your own. Maybe you get a job as a newsie, selling newspapers on the street corner, living out on the street. When it gets too cold, maybe you go home, stay with mom and dad, whatnot. Maybe mom and dad are dead because they're working in a dangerous factory, and you're actually full-time homeless. Who knows? But either way, this is a terrible situation to be in. Imagine, your 11, 12-year-old son, daughter, brother, sister out on the street having to fend for themselves. It's absolutely tragic. And so by taking pictures, it's one thing. Lincoln Steffens, right? He did important work writing about stuff, but it's one thing to read about poverty. It's another thing to actually see it. And when you actually see it, it really tugs on your heartstrings. And, you see the living conditions of these family and how many people are crammed into this tiny little room with no ventilation. And, it's super hot in the summer. There's no bathroom or running water in a lot of cases. And so you're using a bedpan, and it's just got to be awfully, horribly stinky. All these people living right on top of each other spreads, and then every room in the building is like this. And so disease has to just spread, just extraordinarily fast. And so, when people see these things, they're going to start to demand change. And that's what Jacob Riis does. His book, How the Other Half Lives, is going to expose poverty in such a way that it's going to cause Americans to say we have to do something about this. There's enough wealth in America that if we come up with the right taxation system, we can help these kids. And whether it's the building of homeless shelters, or if it's unemployment support, or it's increasing the minimum wage, so these kids don't have to live out on the streets. But people are going to start to come to the realization that we're going to have to do something. And it's Jacob Riis that exposes that. The next major muckraker that we're going to talk about is John D. Rockefeller's greatest rival. Not my words; those are his words. And think about that. Rockefeller went up against Carnegie. He went up against Thomas Scott. He's gone up against the entire oil industry and won all of those battles. And it's going to be Ida Tarbell, a woman, that's going to take her down. And so this is going to be one of those things that's really going to challenge the prevalent idea of the cult of domesticity, that a woman's place is at home, that women aren't capable of being involved in politics. I mean, Ida Tarbell kind of shatters that. And so just so you kind of understand who Ida Tarbell is, her father it was in the oil refining industry. And so he had a small refinery. Right outside of Cleveland. And he gets caught up in what is known as the Cleveland Massacre. And so Rockefeller wants to buy all of these oil refineries, and Ida Tarbell's dad is one of them. And so the Tarbells don't want to sell. They're not fabulously wealthy, but they're making enough money that they've got, a wonderfully beautiful house. We would consider them rich today, but not like, just super, super wealthy. Ida Tarbell is the beneficiary of that. She's going to be able to go to Europe and get an education over there. So everything looks good. And Ida's dad doesn't want to sell to Rockefeller. And so what Rockefeller essentially does is, because he ships so much oil, by this time he's got a monopoly. And so he controls most of the oil industry. What he does is he essentially goes to the railroads and says, "You're going to stop shipping these people's oil." And Ida Tarbell's dad is one of those places. And you're just going to, he can't like actually stop them from shipping it, but he's going to essentially say you're going to gouge them the prices to be able to ship their oil. And if the railroads try and do that to a refinery, it'll kill a refinery, and that's what happens. And so Ida Tarbell's family, because they didn't sell, when the railroads at Rockefeller's behest essentially destroy them, they lose everything. And so Rockefeller then swoops in and buys up some of the refineries, but at a severe discount for way less than what they're worth. Some of them he doesn't even buy; he just lets them completely fail. And so Ida Tarbell's family essentially goes from really well off to in trouble overnight. Now Ida Tarbell is older when this happens. Her family is essentially left destitute, and so they're in trouble. But Ida, because she's got an education, she starts to write for McClure magazine, and which is that progressive magazine that we had talked about before. But on the side, she's working on her book, The History of Standard Oil. This becomes what we recognize today as the first piece of investigative journalism in America. And that's not to say that journalists haven't investigated things before. They have, but they haven't done it to the scale that Ida Tarbell's going to do it. She's going to spend years researching Rockefeller. And to be honest with you, she's going to do it fairly. She doesn't have an agenda. She knows from her experience that Standard Oil's done terrible things, right? But when she writes her book, she does all the research. She looks at all the public records, at the sales between, some refineries to Rockefeller. She interviews former workers, former managers, former executives, and she writes her book. And shocker, she tells the truth. She doesn't spin an agenda on it. She gives Rockefeller credit where it's due. She says he creates all kinds of jobs for people. She says he standardized kerosene production and made it safe. America benefited from that tremendously. Poor people could then afford safe kerosene. So when they, work a 12-hour day, they can spend some time with their family in a lit up room and not have to worry about blowing up in their face. And she celebrates that. But then she also talks about the bad stuff, and she lets the reader kind of decide. And she says, here's how he destroys competition. And here's what he did to all these different businesses. Here are all the political bribes that we know about and how he's influenced the system that way. Here's the safety conditions and the low pay for the workers. And it's going to be that truth telling that's really going to lend her book legitimacy. And it's going to make it into Congress's hands. And Congress is going to read it and they're going to be like, well, we got to look into this. And they're going to look into it and ultimately find out that what she had written about in History of the Standard Oil Company was true, and that it was not in the benefit of the American people. And they're going to use this book to break up Rockefeller's monopoly. And so, this is a kind of truly amazing thing that happens here is, through investigative journalism, which again, not just breaks up Standard Oil, but talk about a blow to the cult of domesticity. This is, a woman that's not supposed to, pursue the intellectual life and isn't supposed to get involved into politics. Just wrote one of the more influential books in American history. it's not Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it's an important piece of literature, and she essentially invents this, or shouldn't say invents, but revolutionizes investigative journalism so much so that we essentially kind of credit her with inventing investigative journalism as it should exist, as an unbiased arbiter of the truth. So the now that we've talked about some of the muckrakers in the progressive movement, we're going to start to talk about the suffrage movement. And so the suffrage movement has really been around in America since Abigail Adams. It's been around since the founding. But we've talked in previous lecture, it kind of gets put off to pursue the abolition of slavery. But then, after slavery is abolished, we're going to really start to see a focus on women's suffrage again. Seneca Falls. So Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton hold the first women's rights convention in 1848, where they really start to build an organization to help get women the right to vote. They're still 82 years off from actually getting women the right to vote, but they lay the kind of groundwork for the modern movement. It's at Seneca Falls, which we've talked about in previous lectures, so I'm going to kind of go through this relatively quickly. They wanted equal rights for women. They wanted, less strict divorce laws so women can get out of abusive marriages. And very controversially, they'll call for women to get the right to vote. The public is going to kind of ridicule them for that. Remember, in 1848, and even in 1920, most women believe in the cult of domesticity, that a woman's place is in the home, and that there are more defined gender roles than kind of what we believe in the 21st century. And so in 1848, the Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will be ridiculed for calling for the right to vote. We're going to start to see that, by the time we get into the 1900s, that people are going to be promoting it more often, promoting women the right to vote. And you'll see resistance of that. And if you take a look here, we see, some propaganda about women getting the right to vote. See, danger. Women's suffrage would double the irresponsible vote. And so the idea is women aren't smart enough to be able to vote. And that's a really tricky statement there, because they're saying like women aren't educated enough in politics to be able to vote. Well, then why is that? Well, it's because we're excluding women. Women go to college at this time, but they're being pushed into majors, that don't include politics, and so we've kind of excluded women from getting that education. It's a menace to the home because it's the belief that it's going to take women out of the home where they're supposed to be raising children, and a burden to men's employment. That it's going to challenge men's job and to essentially to all businesses. And so you see propaganda like this, that women claiming the right to vote can be dangerous to society, which is crazy. I can tell you right now, all the literature that's ever studied this, that when you look at the wealthiest and freest nations on the planet, almost always what the wealthiest nations on the planet include is equality for women. And that's equality of opportunity. You give women the opportunity to work, and it is nothing but good for your economy. As a matter of fact, today, if you're a family with dual incomes, and both parents work and live underneath the same roof and work full time, you have like a 77% chance to be in the middle class or better. I mean, it's women working is a tremendous thing for not just women, but for the family and for society. And so, but in 1848, it's kind of viewed as a threat to men's employment. So you see propaganda like this popping up. There are two gigantic women's organizations that are going to develop to promote women's right to vote. One is the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the other is the American Women's Suffrage Association. And so those two organizations are going to have slightly different views on how to approach women's suffrage and getting women the right to vote. The National Women's Association, this is the more radical women's rights association. After the Civil War, it's the National Women's Suffrage Association, so the top one there, that's going to say no 15th Amendment unless women are included in the right to vote. And so the 15th Amendment is the one that gives black men the right to vote. And so the National Women's Suffrage Association wants to hold the 15th Amendment hostage to get women the right to vote. Now, the American Women's Suffrage Association is going to recognize, hey, we've got a list of things that we need to correct in our democracy, and if we have to do it one piece at a time, that's fine as long as we're always making progress. And so the American Women's Suffrage Association will support the 15th Amendment even if it doesn't include women. So the American Women's Suffrage Association is a little less radical than the National Women's Suffrage Association. Now, by 1890, it becomes irrelevant, right? Because we get the 15th Amendment passed. By 1890, these two organizations are going to merge together to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so they'll merge together. Elizabeth Cady Stanton will become the first president of that group. And they're really going to push for women's involvement in politics using the cult of domesticity, right? Because most American women at this time believe in the cult of domesticity, that women's role is in the home, that raising children, and that that women are the moral component of the family, and that if you take them out of the home, that there'll be problems. And so the National American Women's Suffrage Association is going to use that to convince the average woman that her place is in politics based on the idea that women are the moral authority in the home. And they're going to say, look, if politics are corrupt and women are more morally pure than men, if we want to get the corruption out of politics, we need to include more women into politics because they won't vote for corrupt politicians. Now, we know today that that's not true. Women aren't any more moral than men. Men aren't any more moral than women. That's not, that's actually been studied scientifically, and the studies show that to not be true at all. And so that's not going to work. But it is going to convince women that, hey, maybe we do have a role in politics, and it's to kind of promote morality within politics. And so that'll be part of what is going to gain support for women to get the right to vote. The other thing, really, and we'll talk about this kind of later after we talk about World War I, is women's support for World War I. It's going to be women's support, on the domestic front during World War I, meaning here at home, that they're going to, after the war is over, they're going to look to the President Woodrow Wilson and they're going to say, hey, Woodrow Wilson, you said we went to war in Europe to defend European democracy, but we're not even allowing all of our citizens to vote here at home. We women supported your war effort because we wanted to support democracy. And in return for that, you should give us the right to vote. And he's going to be like, yeah, that makes sense. And then his support will help push the movement over the line. And so he doesn't do it himself, right? I mean, it's this real long, slow build, but it's going to be women making the argument to him that we did our part to protect democracy. You need to fulfill the promise of democracy in America by giving women the right to vote. And so in 1920, we'll get the 19th Amendment, which will ultimately give women the right to vote. So we are going to talk about one more muckraker here before we leave. It's going to be Upton Sinclair. I kind of am saving him for last because he is he's going to have a long story here. So we're going to save him for the last lecture. We're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you again shortly.